Hi there, my name's Lorraine Simmons. Welcome to my introduction to watercolor portrait painting. In this lesson, we're going to go over the materials and tools needed to do a watercolor portrait. Don't worry, you do not need all of these materials here, but these are some of them that I use for a typical portrait painting that I might do. I'll be going over the importance of the reference photos and understanding light and shadow in a portrait painting. So first things first, when I started my journey with watercolor, I used cellulose or wood pulp paper. Now, typically I would 100 recommend, if you're going to invest in getting into watercolor, to really invest in using a cotton paper. The reason for that is cotton is far more absorbent and it really helps with any buckling that you may experience with watercolor, and it makes the experience so much more enjoyable. Having said that, if you are on a budget, there is a great watercolor paper that I can recommend. So Fluid is a brand that does wood pulp paper, and it does 100% cotton paper. And I can say the first time I purchased this Fluid watercolor paper, I purchased it by accident, not reading the label, and I could not believe that it was wood pulp, but had a really great experience. There was some really great granulation that happened in the paper and some great effects. It was nice and easy to lift and it performed really well. So I definitely recommend this paper here. It's the Fluid cold press, or also the hot press is great. It's actually only bound on two edges. So I love using pads that, when I say it's only bound on two edges, it's only bound on the two long sides of the paper there. Definitely recommend it. If you have a little bit more to stretch, recommend just going right into a cotton paper. You're gonna have, it's far more absorbent. This one is also only glued on two edges, but it's great paper. I'm not overly loyal to the different paper I use. I've used all kinds, including Saunders Waterford, Winsor Newton, a couple more that I can't remember. But today, for the demonstration, I will be using Baohong, and this paper is new to me. This one I haven't actually lifted the protective cover sheet yet, but which is why it's yellow. This one is made in China, and there's been lots of really great reviews. I've really enjoyed using it so far, but I'll be using this instead of a 9x12. I will be doing this on a 12x16. So working on a larger piece of paper there. And the reason being is because as we're using this reference photo, as a personal preference and choice, whenever I'm doing a portrait painting, I always love to be able to paint the portrait of a person's head as close to being life-size as possible. So I'm not sure how big my head is, but I imagine it's probably somewhere between here. So this would be nice if I'm doing kind of like a close, a closer shot of someone's face. But for this composition, I'm going to probably keep it a little bit wider to keep some of the story of what's going on there. So I'm choosing to use a larger piece of paper so that I can maintain the size of our head as being as close to being a life size as possible. So that's a little bit about paper and the size of paper I choose to work on. Sometimes it can be, I'm just going to let you know now, when I first started watercolor painting, I used like the smallest bits of paper, and as my confidence grew and as I really wanted to use the movement of my arm and my body into the painting, I needed to get bigger on bigger paper just so that I can move my body. It's so much more enjoyable that way, and I feel like you get a lot more energy and movement into a painting when you're working on something that's pretty large. The next thing is watercolor paints. I started my watercolor journey on using student grade paints. I will let you know that student grade paints are great if you want to experiment with watercolor, but you have to use so much water to try and or so much paint, sorry, to try to get really thick, rich values. Values is the range of when it's light to dark. So if you want to get a really deep dark value, you really have to, I find that you really had to grind into those little paint pans to get those really thick values. When you're using artist quality paints, you're going to get a larger pigment to medium ratio, and so it really allows you to have those deep rich pigments, and they're great. I will point out a couple of pigments we'll be using for this demo. The main brands that I love using are Daniel Smith and Rockwell watercolors. Now, Daniel Smith is an American brand, and they have a crazy range of pigments that you can use. I can probably, I think it's over 200 colors. If you're not sure which ones to use, you can actually buy little dot cards from them and test them out yourself. But I'm going to, and Rockwell's a Canadian brand, and they make great pigments, and they also use a lot of mineral pigments as well, minerals to make their paints. So some of the 4 mineral pigments that I believe I am using in this demonstration is Rhodonite, Serpentine, Amazonite, and Amethyst. And I just wanted to show you guys examples of what these raw minerals look like, and so how they would produce these pigments here in a tube is, these aren't the best examples of the minerals, but Rhodonite is actually a better sample would be a little bit more pink. But what they would do is that they will find really great samples of this, and they'll grind it down with these special machines, and you can learn more about that on through Daniel Smith. And then they would, after grinding it, will mix it with the medium. So I thought that's kind of really interesting, maybe interesting for you to see. So we'll be using those ones for the demo. I used to start in pans, but now, because I use so much paint, there's some really cool things you can do when you're using tube colors. With tube colors, if you were a little bit more experimental, you can actually put the pigment from the tube right onto the piece of paper, and then let the pigments run. And you're finding, because you're not having to add water to the pan or the pigment first, and you can just get the pigment right on paper, you can get some really cool and stronger effects. So it's a little bit more expensive, but if you know you already love watercolor and you're going to dive in, definitely recommending moving from pans to tubes. But if you're just starting out, stick with pans. They're great. The next thing I'm going to talk about are brushes. The majority of brushes I use are Kolinsky Sable brushes. Kolinsky Sable brushes are natural brushes that come from a Kolinsky weasel. I can't remember. I purchased mine from Rosemary brushes from England, and those are ethically made. The thing with a Kolinsky Sable, they are a little pricey. You can get synthetic sable if you're just experimenting and just starting out, but I love Kolinsky because of once you they hold so much water and they keep their shape, and it's got a nice springiness to it. Like I find that with some synthetic brushes, they can become a little bit stiff. This one's a synthetic one. But again, if you're just starting out, you're probably not going to really notice or appreciate the differences that much. I certainly didn't. You might. I love these Kolinskys because once you get them wet, they keep their point excellently. as a general rule of thumb, not that you can't break them, when I start a painting, I will use the biggest brushes first. And this enables me to kind of get the pigment down, get the energy into the painting as I need to. And then as I go down, I will and start focusing on the different details of someone's features. I will start to move into a smaller brush. These brushes here just happen to be my travel brushes. This is an 8, and so it packs away really nicely if you ever wanted to travel with them. So those are great. And I usually finish off with this one. Oh, I should tell you. So this one is a size 12 rosemary, around a size 10, a size 8, a size 6, and this is a size 3. So this one helps me just get the last bits of details in towards the end of the painting. I have this rosemary brush as well, which is the extended point. Sometimes I like getting this one wet and just running it through to kind of create texture or hair-like texture and effects, or if I just want to get these gentle wisps in. It's a fun little brush. I don't want to go too crazy on smaller brushes because I find that with my style of work, you want to really keep a sense of mystery and atmosphere. And if you're using small brushes throughout all of it, you're going to create a lot of you can create a lot of hard lines scattered throughout the painting, and it's going to be really hard for the viewer to identify what they need to focus on. So I typically reserve my smaller brushes only for the anchor points of the face, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but typically the anchor points of a face are the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. I'm just going to go there now, actually. If you ever think about a three-pronged plug, you can typically identify when you look at it. I don't know if you do this in your head, but for me, when I look at a three-pronged plug, it looks like a face, and there's something in your brain that when you see those, it looks like two eyes and a nose, and so your brain kind of imagines the mouth and imagines the eyes and nose, if you will. And so it's very similar. They say if you can get the anchor points of the face correctly, which meaning like the corners of the eyes at the right distance and the right proportions to the nose and the mouth, and so the corners of the mouth and the corners of the nose there, you will achieve likeness really well. So that is why when I'm using when I'm doing a portrait painting, I typically leave the smaller brushes alone, and I only really use them for a little bit of detail, and I mostly just in those anchor point areas. So that's that. This brush here is what Rosemary has called or designed as the Eradicator brush. And this is a synthetic brush, and I discovered it as I purchased my travel pack. And this is actually one of my favorite brushes, and I usually use this brush right at the end. And this brush I use, it's they call it the Eradicator, but I use it, they advertise it, and they recommend to use it as a lifting brush, which is what I do. And what I love about this brush is that what you would do is you get a little bit of water on it, and then actually I might be able to demo it here for you while we're here. You can actually use it to lift watercolor. And that's the great thing about watercolor. Oh, I should also say, this is why it's also really always handy to have a bit of paper towel right by hand. But you can see here, it's you're able to just lift that watercolor out in these great lines. This is just a small little brush, and I love using this to lift out highlights when I kind of gone a little bit too heavy on the values. I love lifting this out to create texture in hair. When I see that in areas a little bit boring, especially in like hair areas. This is how I create my highlights. For you, those of you that don't use the watercolor, that's the great thing about watercolor, is that because watercolor is fluid, if the watercolor is not staining, you can lift it. I'll just also show you here as well. So you just kind of get it a little bit wet, and as you kind of go back and forth, you can lift out these lines. I find it really helpful to lift out the highlights just around a cupid's bow sometimes, lifting out highlights in the eyes or the eyelids, lifting out highlights in hair, creating interesting texture and things. Super fun brush, love it, rely on it. So that's that. Those are my brushes. What else do I have? I will show you my palette. Now for the demo, I'm actually going to be using about 8 colors for the demo, so I do need to get another palette, and I'll be using this to mix, but I'm just going to bring over my my studio palette, which I won't be using on the demo because it's too big to fit into the frame. This is my studio palette. It's organized generally in kind of a, what do you call it, a color wheel. These are some of my favorite pigments. Sometimes I get bored of them and I can use like a palette knife to like lift them out and start again. But typically if I'm painting, for portraits specifically, I do tend to keep very specific palettes. And so I have these little ceramic dishes, and I'll just place it right in the middle, and I will mix my colors in around there. I love a ceramic dish because it doesn't puddle, it doesn't puddle in a way where it's annoying, but I don't know if you ever used a plastic palette, but sometimes I just find it's really hard to mix because you get those little droplets. But with ceramic dish, you don't get that. It kind of puddles and pools really nicely, so it's really great to mix the colors on there. You don't need to have a fancy palette, honestly. You can also just go to the DIY store and get like a ceramic white tile and just put your pigment on. If you're using, especially if you're using 2 paints, and you just dot them on your tile there, and then you can mix your paints from there. So that's my studio palette. But like I said, for the demo, I'll be using a smaller one so you can see how I'm mixing my colors. Another really important point when you're, you don't have to do this, but I like to do this, is my water containers. I always like to have at least 2 water containers. This water container is the water container that I would use to clean up my brush. And then once I've cleaned out my brush, I will, and I want to get fresh water. And that is exactly what I would do for here. So I just wanted to show you as well. Some watercolor artists really love to rely on a paper towel to control the amount of water. That's not my style. You don't have to do it this way, but just so you know what I do. What I do for water control is I don't know what you would call that, but I basically like wipe my brush against the side of my water container to get the amount of water I want. So if I want a full amount of water, that's what it's going to look like. If I want, and I just wipe the side of my brush against my water container, and that is how I control my water. For those of you who haven't used watercolor before, a lot of watercolor is all about water control. You'll find if you use a Kolinsky brush, you might end up with a ginormous puddle of water on your paper, and that's okay, especially when you're learning. As you kind of progress, you learn to control the amount of water you need. Typically, the more water you use, the runnier there is, the more, the lighter the value, and the less water you use, the darker the value it will be. Yeah, so that's that. And as you can see with my Kolinsky brushes, they all come to a beautiful point when they get wet, which I love. It's really great. Even with a size 12, you can get a good amount of energy and detail into your painting. So that's that. I recommend having 2 containers for your water, so you don't try and keep your colors as pure and fresh as possible. Another thing I will also talk about is for your initial sketch. So right now I'm really loving these Blackwing Pearl pencils. Has a lovely amount of pigment on it. It comes across pretty soft, and I find that once you after you paint on it, it's really easy to rub away. It's not so hard that it leaves those pressure marks in the paper. So do be careful when you are doing your initial reference sketch onto your watercolor paper. If you are an artist that likes to have a reference sketch underneath before, unless it's your style, I personally like to not press too hard on my paper, so I can try to preserve the natural look of the paper as much as possible. I find that these pencils rub out really well once you finish the painting, so I enjoy that. Erasers I've used, it can be any eraser. I sometimes use this cheap artist plastic razor. You can also buy a fancy razor if you want to as well, so completely up to you. But usually if you're going to erase any of your pencil lines in a painting, do make sure your painting is dry so you don't ruin the way the pigment has formed on the paper there. And last of all, I will just talk a little bit about highlights and whites. There's 3 ways in which you can preserve the whites on, or have highlights on your piece of paper. The first way, which is my preferred way if I can do it, is I simply will not paint on that part that I need to have that highlight. So an example here would be the arm of our reference photos I'm used of today. My first choice is to not paint and avoid that area completely. If sometimes, depending on your style and depending what you want to do, it can be impossible. And in this one today, I may experiment with a little bit of masking fluid. So there's many kinds of masking fluid. I think I might just try and here. So I personally like to have a colorless art masking fluid. This one here is Winsor Newton. If you're going to go use something like this, it's totally fine. You sometimes need something to help carry that pigment. And let me see if I can find what I'm looking for. I can't. That's okay. There are things that you can buy to carry the pigment, especially with masking fluid. The ones that I have on hand right now are these. These are actually kind of like silicone tipped tools, which you can kind of use to dip into the masking fluid and then draw straight onto the paper. When you're lifting masking fluid off your paper, do make sure it is bone dry. And I like to use an eraser to help me just pick up the masking fluid, especially if they're like really fine bits of masking fluid that you're using. And then that is how I do that. Another really great product, which is by Daniel Smith, is this masking fluid with an applicator. This is great because it comes with lots of little tips, and what you would do is after you shake it, you will remove the protective cover, and you can grab one of these little plastic nozzles and use that to draw really fine lines and things, and that would prevent the pigments from staining the paper. And then you would rub it off with an eraser. when your paper is bone dry. The last method I use for highlights, if I lose them or if I just want to add a little bit of detail, is I will either use, this is supposed to be a opaque white watercolor ink. Sometimes I will use this, or I will also use just some designer gouache. And just a really important note, I always make sure that these pigments stay far away from any of my main palettes. I would never ever put any of these pigments onto my palette in here, but I would personally, I like to keep it in a nice little mini jar, or I would just put the gouache right onto the paper and onto my scrap piece of paper and use my paper as a palette to paint with. The reason being is if you mix these pigments with your watercolors, you're gonna get a very chalky, opaque kind of thing. If that's what you want, that's great. Do that, but that is what I'm trying to avoid. I want to try and keep my watercolors as fresh and transparent as possible, so I'm not going to do that. So there is a little bit about the materials that I've used. Next, I'll be letting you know a little bit about the importance of reference photos. Whenever I'm, usually when I have a commission, then I would always have an interview or a free consultation with my client. And one thing I make very clear to my client is to make sure that they provide a good reference photo. Sometimes people just don't know what they don't know, and you'll get they'll send you a photo of their dog or their child or the person they love, and their head is about this big to the size of the photo, and they want you to make a little close-up of their face here, which is absolutely impossible. I know I can't produce good work that way, so I try to make it really clear that if I have a portrait photo from them, that I need their head to be as large as possible, especially for the typical kind of portrait work that I do. Another thing that's really important with your reference photos is, again, sometimes you can get reference photos and they're really, the person looks great, but the photo is poorly lit. If you want to, you can take on that job, or it's like their face is lit by room lighting, and I find that with that it can be very flat. I personally love the results you can get from natural lighting, even if it's like golden hour lighting, or even mid like full noon lighting. Full noon is a little bit strong, but you 100% you get a better sense of the colors, the textures, the tones, and the life of the person when the photo is taken in natural daylight. So that's just my style or where I want to go. There's always exceptions, so use your best judgment. But if it's a really dark photo, it's going to be really hard for you to pick out some of the details. Now, there are times where you will want that when you want to create a certain atmosphere of mood, but that's an important request I make known to people who typically commission my work. People who ask me for commissions, they typically have seen the existing work that I've done before, and they want a really nice, clear picture of someone's face. So get the right kind of reference photo from your clients that you need to in order to produce your best work, and educate your clients or your collectors. Yeah. So that's a little bit about the importance of a good reference photo. I will also say, even when I get a reference photo of a person, especially if it's someone, a loved one or something special, I will always try to get as many photos of the subject as possible, so I get a good idea of that person's likeness, their character, their personality, what they look like from different angles. It will help you create more of a fuller sense of who that person is in order for you to tell the story. So that's also very important too, or important to me. So that's a little bit about understanding the reference photo, understanding light and shadow. I will talk a little bit about now just a little bit about this reference photo and the light and shadow. You can see that the light appears to be coming from kind of this angle here. She's a little bit backlit because you can see the light falling on her face here, but then you can see it's a little bit cooler across her body along here. So the sun's coming in from this angle, slightly cooler tones across her face. At certain points of her body there are just capturing the sun, like her knees, the back of her shoulders and the top of her shoulders right here, and the light is just skimming her face. It's barely catching her chin, and the light has captured the top of her hair and her bangs right there. So that is something that I want to be aware of when we're painting. And this, you can also see that the background, the value here, is a lot lighter. So for those of you who are maybe beginners, here, this is something I purchased earlier. This is a grayscale or value finder. So usually the higher the value, or the lighter the value, the more white it is. The darker the value, or lower the value, the darker it is. So for me personally, even to this date, I still sometimes struggle in seeing the different values, and having one of these is really helpful. You don't need to buy one. You can just make one by getting, a dark paint and just gradually adding more and more water to it to kind of get your that value finder, and then you can use it that way. But this one I didn't have to make, so it's great. Anyway, you can see here that the values of the background are actually lighter than her face, so that is something to be aware of. And then this area here, I'd say, is probably darker than her face. So all of these are really important. Value is always more important than hue or color. If you can get the values right, which is the lightness and the darkness of the painting correct, you can almost use whatever color here and the story would still make sense, generally speaking. A helpful tool that I like to make is I sometimes like to notarize my reference photo that I picked. There are apps that you can use to do this, or you can use Photoshop. I can let you know what app I use in the show notes to do this, but this for me is just a nice, easy, quick reference, just for me to kind of start kind of understanding the light in the photo that I'm looking at. So it kind of breaks it down into little blocks. Sometimes I use this as a reference as well when I'm painting, just to kind of, especially with watercolor, it's very quick, and sometimes it's really nice just to get those values in there as your building block and foundation of your painting. So yes, thank you for sticking around for all of that. Hopefully some of that was helpful. If you're a pro at this already, that's just how this is the process that I use, and I will join you again in the next lesson, where we'll be talking a lot about preparing the sketch for a commissioned photo or commissioned painting. There you go.